course, we recognise it's a disease. You can look at the brain scans, you can see the atrophy in the brain that Alzheimer's disease causes, etc. But that doesn't exclude also understanding it as a disability as well. If the impairments caused by different forms of dementia are recognised as a disability, then that brings a whole host of additional potential benefits for people living with dementia about how they live their lives, how they can be included in society, how they can be recognised as equal citizens with the same rights and entitlements as people, other people with impairments, but also people without impairments. And it just changes the whole, so potentially changes the whole narrative about how dementia is understood, while still recognising that it is a disease. It's important still to carry on resourcing research into treatments and to provide good care and support for people with living with dementia, etc. So it's a winner both ways. And I think for too long it's just been either disability hasn't even been brought into the debate or discussion around dementia, or it's not being fully recognised, or I think there's been a misunderstanding around what disability means. That disability means something very different when it's used in the context of the Equality Act, the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, the way the disability activist movement has used it in really powerful ways, that disability is something that is almost imposed upon individuals with impairments by society. And so society often makes it then really difficult for people with those impairments to be included, to participate, to enjoy a life that everybody else is able to enjoy, because society doesn't make the accommodations, the changes, provide the support, have the often individuals and groups of individuals don't have the understanding about what disability or dementia is, which means they have very negative attitudes, which results in all the negative language we hear. But by using that social model of disability, which says that the things that need to change are things within wider society, not the individual themselves, is a way then of seeing disability as almost as a vehicle for obviously enabling people to become equal citizens and be able to participate through making practical changes in physical environments, changing people's attitudes and behaviours as much as possible, changing the way the narrative is articulated. And I think particularly, although they may sound slightly crass, and sometimes I think there's still some patronising attitudes in the way people view people with physical disabilities, I think things like the Paralympics and even and Help for Heroes, for example, is suddenly people with very severe physical impairments are seen as, these are people who serve their country, these are people who can achieve amazing things at sporting arenas and so on, and we should therefore celebrate their lives and recognise they've had a difficult time, but that with the right support and the right resources, they can overcome that to live a decent life. And there is an element of patronising. I think sometimes it is patronising, or some of those views come from a patronising place. But I think definitely compared to how physical disability was viewed when I was growing up, it's changed very dramatically in the way people are perceived. And I think that change is also taking place more slowly, but nevertheless recognisably for people with learning disabilities, for example, where there's a whole narrative around inclusion and citizenship, which is really important and a great success. I think around mental health issues, definitely, because the stigma is being consistently challenged around mental health problems, which is part of the work that social model of disability needs to enable to happen, and with sensory impairments. And now it's just beginning to get going with dementia as well, and that will hopefully change things dramatically in terms of how people with dementia perceive themselves and are perceived and can live their lives for as long as possible in a way that means they can participate and are not excluded and subject to stigma and so on and so forth, while still clearly, particularly towards the end of the end of the journey with dementia, still needing high quality care and support. So I think that's another important thing, is that because it's become such a, to use that euphemism of being kept in the shadows for so long, that's another example of how a disability narrative can say, actually, it's no longer acceptable that we just assume that people with very severe dementia get shunted off into a care home of varying quality. Some are really good, some aren't. But that we should actually say, is this the only way we can support people with this very severe impairment? Do they all need to go into care homes? Are there different options? No other disability where people with those disabilities have been activists would put up with being put into institutions in the way that so many people with dementia are these days. So that might change the way we perceive care for people with severe dementia, and change the quality of care, perhaps in care homes, which I think is changing quite significantly, although I don't really think that's yet because of the disability narrative. But it, simply by raising the profile of dementia, as has been done over the last 10, 15 years, in a way, unthinkingly, that has been about challenging stigma, which is about the social model of disability beginning to sort of kick in. We should talk about disability, and why we should talk about it with an understanding that this is something really helpful for people, not something that's a label. What practical changes can an organisation make that would demonstrate actually it was adhering or complying or meeting or even exceeding the requirements of the Equality Act to ensure that people with dementia are able to participate or contribute to that organisation in some way. There's quite a lot of positive rights in the CRPD, which is different to the Equality Act, around rights to services, rights to inclusion, rather than just prohibitions on people shouldn't be excluded, which our Equality Act tends to focus more on. But are there things that the CRPD says that people with disabilities should be able to enjoy or to be included in, which would be relevant to the organisations who are going to use that resource? And an organisation, whoever it is, saying, not only do we adhere to the Equality Act and therefore have a plan, because you wouldn't expect people to have to change overnight, but have a plan to how we're going to ensure that we're meeting the requirements of the Equality Act, to ensure that the physical access, the sort of the psychosocial access, if you want, the cognitive ramps, the cognitive access to our organisation mean that people with dementia can be completely included. But also we're going to go beyond that, and we're going to say, what can we do to ensure that we're meeting the requirements of the UNCRPD, which is being even more proactive, perhaps in terms of employment. And why shouldn't a large organisation working around in the field of dementia think about how do we employ people with dementia to work for our organisation, because they come with so much lived experience, and what does that mean? And it would. But if we could do that, then we'd definitely be taking a big step towards meeting, say, the article in the CRPD around employment as well. So, I mean, I think it's about encouraging organisations to make a plan, I guess, and a plan that they're going to implement over 2 or 3 years, about here are some key elements of the Equality Act and the CRPD, and here are things you might consider to actually try and do to demonstrate you're complying with, meeting the requirements of, if not exceeding the legal requirements around disability rights. The other thing about thinking around sort of dementia as a disability is there are those tools like the panel principles, which I've always thought there's no reason why an organisation, a voluntary sector organisation, a local authority, any agency working in the field that supports people with disabilities, but obviously in this case, particularly people with dementia, if they wanted to do a review of how they operated and were interested in how do we apply disability rights to make our work meaningful and compliant with the law, particularly for people with dementia, here's quite a simple toolbox and quite a tangible toolbox, better than other toolboxes, I think, around you get people with the impairment involved, you make sure you're meeting legal requirements, you make sure you're accountable in what you do, and the other words that the panel acronym stands for, and you apply that, you have your plan of what you're going to do, and then you have panel to kind of ensure that that's inclusive, it's legal, it's not in any way inadvertently discriminating against particular groups of people, and it's accountable, and use that as a way to push the whole thing forward. I think sometimes disability rights or human rights can seem, as we've discussed, can seem so overwhelming for an organisation that they, apart from meeting the basic legal requirements, the Equality Act, they back off really. And it does, obviously requires leadership and understanding, is that people can understand the very basic reasons why dementia does constitute a disability as well as a disease. Because if they don't get that, then that will be a real stumbling block. And also to support people with dementia who say, but I don't think I'm disabled, I just think I have this disease, and say that's absolutely fine. We're not saying you have to now talk about yourself as having a disability. If you don't like that language, that doesn't matter at all. It doesn't mean you're excluded from still being able to enjoy and be included within legislation, disability legislation, which enables you to more fully participate. So you don't have to use a disability language at all, but just have to remember that it does apply in certain circumstances. But it's also just about inclusion of people with lived experience. So embedding dementia as a disability into our organisation, how do we ensure that the voice of people with lived experience is constantly there in the organisation in a way that our staff, our volunteers can learn from, can listen with, can engage with, and I suppose use to understand dementia as a disability. Meeting basic needs is really important to make sure people are safe and comfortable, free from physical pain or physical illness. But I think the right thing would say yes to all of that. That's definitely meeting their human rights, particularly CRPD. But I think there's something about it's about recognizing that if you just leave them on, if you do that and then leave them on their own, they'll be happy. That's your job done. That doesn't feel like you're really meeting the person's human rights around social contact and inclusion and a relationship and so on and so forth. And whether it's sitting next to them, holding their hand, or having a conversation, even if they're not able to respond, listening to the radio with them, even doing stuff like the kind of intensive interaction where you're not even necessarily saying words, but you're kind of repeating back to the person the noises they're making. It may be, and the validation therapy, the work of Naomi Feel, although sometimes it can make us a bit uncomfortable to watch that, it's a really important human interaction that is happening, and it needs to be done in a way that is respectful and is done on the basis of having a knowledge of what you're doing. But I think that's a really important part of a human rights approach, that you're trying to constantly include the person in a situation where their ability to be included is very limited. So having to adapt all the more, the accommodation you're making is enormous as a care worker. Of course, you might not always have time to do this, but when you do have time, the reasonable adjustment you're making is, I'm going to always spend my time with people in different rooms in this care home, and doing that and chatting to them and trying to find out how they're feeling or if they have any particular need. But in order to really demonstrate your understanding that this person has rights as a disabled person as well as needs as a person with dementia, and what can you do to meet those rights? Well, think about particularly inclusion and participation. I think those are the key words for me, that those don't mean you've got to have them charging around, going out and about all the time, just so they know they're part of a community, that there's relationships around them, there's people who care for them, as adults, as people, not just as someone with dementia. And they are able to do that in creative ways, which are still respectful, even if the person is, as I say, very severely impaired sensorily and cognitively. Well, that's another great example of a very obvious reasonable adjustment, and a reasonable adjustment and accommodation that any organisation should be doing now to ensure that people with dementia can continue to participate or start participating in the work of that organisation, whether it's an activity or campaigning or reviewing documents or policies or something, that the reasonable adjustment must be to ensure that a wide range of people can use technology. And obviously there's some people who really struggle with technology. You can do things online, and actually by learning how to go online and do things like Zoom, you're learning new skills, which you can then transfer across into contacting friends and family. So there's an absolute benefit, an imperative in a way, to enable people to be able to use technology if they want to and if they can, which isn't just about, there's a stopgap measure until we can all meet up and have nice support groups. It's really important. So that's another example of an accommodation, a reasonable adjustment. Organisations have to think very carefully about how they do that if they want to include people with dementia in their work. If there's a law there, you have people have recourse to challenging situations, incidents that arise where people's rights are clearly not being supported or adhered to. So I think one should stick with the principle that here is as a legal framework that you can go back to and potentially use either in an individual case, something that's complicated, or an organisation can support an individual, or through campaigning or messaging. I think it's not about separating human rights from social care. They're joined together, and that doesn't mean that human rights make social care more complicated. And you can think of good examples of where human rights is being applied through engagement with people, the activity coordinator stuff, the supporting people to do Zoom. So it's important to focus on where human rights is being successfully applied, because I think that makes people realise, okay, we might not be getting it right in all places, but that's because we're coming at it from the wrong point of view. We're thinking it was something that you put on top of social care, rather than it can inform, support, good social. It's melding the two together, I think. An application of human rights through that legislation for people with dementia should also benefit family care. The distress and frustration that might be caused by someone getting lost because they can't find the loo, or they can't work out how the taps work in flashy hotels where they're scalding themselves. That's not just an injury to the person with dementia, but it's going to cause immense distress and upset for family carers. So I suppose that's important as well. No, the important thing is to try and build alliances with our disability groups, and say, actually, we share so much in common here about experiences of not having our rights upheld and respected, that we need to come together as much as possible and campaign on things that affect all of us. Blue Badge campaign was a fantastic example there of two disability groups who the general public would in no way put together whatsoever. They would not understand why people with autism and people with dementia have got anything common, because they wouldn't necessarily understand the impairments. But actually, here's something that unifies them, and was campaigned on really effectively to achieve a human rights result around this adjustment must be inclusive of people with cognitive impairments as well as physical impairments. And it's a great example of where, what I was saying right at the beginning, a challenge, using the law to challenge something, a great example of disability groups coming together and achieving something really tangible, positive, and important. Another example of where we actually put it in the resource of where dementia has been devalued is the lack of resources going into research. So again, it's a great example of it's not either or. It's if you understand dementia as a disease and a disability, you can then campaign more for more resources, as I think I might have said, to go into research to find more effective treatments. And then it's not that anybody wants to say dementia is a disability and is it wonderful and it should stay like that forevermore. It has to be a means to an end, not the end in itself.